And a lot of things, even for me, started here in Oxford in June of 1996, when I visited the Modern Papers reading room to look at some of the Tolkien material. And just back then, I had to have a letter of introduction to the Bodleian Library that was signed by an Oxford graduate, and my professor Austin signed it, Timothy Austin, Oxon at the end. And I was just so impressed to hold this letter and everything, and went to Modern Papers. And there was where I found out about the full-length version, Beowulf, that became Beowulf and the Critics, of the Monsters and the Critics lecture. The thought that was just about 30 years ago is entirely horrifying, and so I'm going to skip right over that and go back even further. And this would be to the fall of 1978, when probably because doing the project gave us an excuse to sit in the back of the classroom and talk instead of doing whatever the class was supposed to be doing, my best friend and I, my best friend Chipper, that really was his name, and I wrote an adapted play of part of The Lord of the Rings. Carefully considering which out of all the really exciting and iconic scenes of that great epic that we would dramatize for our play, we carefully thought them all through, and we chose the Council of Elrond. Of course, because a long meeting in which a variety of characters talk a lot is obviously the best scene for a bunch of fifth graders to perform. And how we didn't end up as the next Spielberg and Lucas is a mystery. But perhaps surprisingly, the council made for a pretty decent play. There are a lot of characters, so lots of people could participate. All the dramatic interaction is done through speech rather than through action, so we didn't need props or special effects. And the dialogue is generally more in the form of set pieces, which fifth graders are a lot better at than back and forth dialogue. In fact, I still have this script, and looking it over it 47 years later, I can make the case that in a way we did better than Peter Jackson did at communicating all the essential information. And I will say, at least Chipper and I never came up with anything as ridiculous as Gimli the dwarf trying to break the ring with a battle axe. So we have that going for us. But I'm beginning this talk on Tolkien's heterotextuality with the Council of Elrond because it is by far the most multivocal chapter in The Lord of the Rings. There are at least 13 characters present. The speech of 23 are presented in quotation or paraphrase, and each of these speakers has a distinctive and distinguishable speaking style. Although, except for Gaffer Gamgee's reported speech, there's no real departures from standard English spelling and grammar. Tom Shippey first noted that language variation gives Tolkien a thorough and economical way of dramatizing ethical debate. And the interactions that are marked by this variation, they demonstrate the different kinds of rhetoric and their relative powers available to the characters. 12 of the characters present at the council speak, and 3 of those tell stories in which they quote the speech of others not present. The deepest embedding is Gandalf's retelling of Radagast the Brown Wizard's quotation of Saruman the White Wizard. In every case, Tolkien follows the conceit that the reported voice is accurately depicted. Now, the council begins with a comment from a narrator that not all that was spoken and debated in the council need now be told. Much was said of events in the world outside, especially in the south and wide lands east of the mountains. Then, without preamble, Glowin the Dwarf presents his news. But before the others can speak up, Elrond, the host, pauses to set the agenda and immediately tells his own tale of the deep history of Sauron and the Rings of Power. However, his exact words, which are said to have taken most of the morning to speak, are not presented. Instead, the reader is given a single paragraph summary of the forging of the rings in the Second Age. To this point, Tolkien has adroitly handled the information flow in the speech variation, demonstrating a great deal of the Raznorecha, the varied speechness or heteroglossia that Michael Bakhtin, who coined this term, saw as the quality as being the single most important characteristic of the novel. So it's hardly unique to Tolkien. Indeed, if the Council of Elrond were expanded to novel length and told the complete story of The Lord of the Rings in the same way, with each chapter maybe being a narration of a different character, the result would probably not be qualitatively different than a lot of other modern novels. You just have like as I lay dying in Middle-earth. But then, in the next sentence in the Council of Elrond, a new quality emerges. Then, through all the years that followed, he traced the ring. But since that history is elsewhere recounted, even as Elrond himself set it down in his books of lore, it is not here revealed. And here we start to have heterotextuality in addition to multivocality or heteroglossia. The narrator's statement implies a set of relationships between two sets of events, the discussion at the Council of Elrond and the history relating to the forging of the Rings of Power, and two or more texts. And that is the chapter, the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring that people are reading, and Elrond's books of lore. The text we are reading is identified as being incomplete in two ways. It does not contain the complete transcript of the things said in the council about events in the South and the East, and much of the history that Elrond related, though not the exact words he spoke, can be found in his lore books. Both the existence of those books of lore and their accessibility is implied, emphasizing the distance between the reader of the text and the imagined receiver of the narrative, who is assumed to have the ability to consult those necessary books, otherwise why mention them and then not quote from them? But merely just invoking extra text is not enough. And besides, plenty of other authors do that all the time. The aesthetic and emotional effects of heterotextuality require that the reader perceive the influence of other texts in the main narrative, and not just an epigraph from something called the Manual of Muad'Dib, a quote said to be from the Tleilaxu God Book, a catalog reference to the girl who circumnavigated fairyland in a ship of her own making, or a mention of the Necronomicon. I could say that, for example, I could say that 3 paragraphs of the talk I'm giving today were actually written by my pet unicorn, Clarence. But if the reader doesn't, for some reason, perceive the influence of Clarence in any particular paragraphs, there is no real effect of heterotextuality. But in the Council of Elrond, the very abstract heterotextuality invoked by the mention of Elrond's books of lore is augmented over the course of the chapter by the inclusion of distinct texts, even if these are said to be part of the speech of the various characters there. Boromir repeats the words that he heard spoken by the voice in a dream. Bilbo recites the poem he previously composed for Aragorn. Gandalf reports the words he read that Isildur wrote in the scroll, and the words that Sauron inscribed on the ring. But despite being labeled as speech, at least the poems, the material from the scroll, and the ring inscription are printed in italics and lack the inverted commas that indicate every other example of regular speech in The Lord of the Rings. And this formatting implies that readers are supposed to think of the texts as being written material. In the interest of time, I'm leaving out all the evidence that supports this conclusion, but there actually is evidence that supports this conclusion. You can ask about it later if you want. There are similar references to additional texts throughout The Lord of the Rings. Sam recites a stanza that Aragorn identifies as being Bilbo's translation of the Fall of Gil-galad, which is in an ancient tongue, thus implying the existence of at least 2 texts that are outside the Lord of the Rings, one of which is being quoted and one is not. That is the original lay in the ancient tongue and Bilbo's complete translation. Similarly, Aragorn's recitation on Weathertop invokes both a poetic version of the Beren and Luthien story, written in the mode that is called An Thenoth among the elves, and also a written translation, possibly by him. Otherwise, his comment that the poem is hard to render into our common speech, and that what he recites is but a rough echo of it, means that we are supposed to believe that Strider is translating poetry from one language into poetry in another language on the fly. And while I am perfectly willing to believe that Aragorn can fight his way through all the hosts of Mordor or run 135 miles in 3 days, he is not Superman. So I have to believe there was a written version of that text that he made. And again, in the interest of time, I won't catalog all the other texts in The Lord of the Rings. There are a lot, but I will point out that like Bilbo's birthday speech, they are sometimes incorporated without explanation into the main texts. Some of the implied texts are what we should probably call pseudo texts, like the Fall of Gil-galad, because they never existed. Tolkien never wrote them, he just refers to them. But others of the implied or reference texts were indeed part of the massive Silmarillion archive that Tolkien had created over many years. And one that seems like it would be a total pseudo-text, the pages Gandalf quotes from the Book of Mazarbul, actually refers to an extant physical text that Tolkien made, the facsimile pages of the damaged manuscript. Now, I've given some examples of what I mean by heterotextuality because I didn't want to start this talk with just definition mongering, because that is almost certainly the most tedious and boring kind of mongering that there is. But I guess there needs to be some definition for the term at this point. And since it turns out that there isn't one anywhere authoritative, possibly because as of 2 years ago, Google thought I coined the word heterotextuality, which I don't believe for a second, by the way. It's too obvious a coinage, but it's really nice of them to think that. And all the times I found it in people using it from search engines, they just mean multivocality. They're just using it as a synonym. But I'll just say that heterotextuality is a quality of certain works of literature that produce the impression that they are composed by the amalgamation of other previously existing texts. Heterotextuality can produce multivocality, but that is not inevitable, and multivocality does not require heterotextuality. Additionally, a work's heterotextuality does not necessarily mean that the work is composite in authorship or otherwise, The Lord of the Rings being a good example, although composite works often produce this impression of heterotextuality. And by the way, not only do I think I did not make up the word heterotextuality, I don't for a minute think that Tolkien invented it, or for that matter, pseudotexts. Mallory's The French Book Saith, always with stuff that he's making up rather than stuff that he got somewhere, is the earliest example of a pseudo-text that I can think of. Maybe Chaucer's The Book of the Lion, but he doesn't do anything with the Book of the Lion except mention it. And there are surely many pseudo-texts in other traditions, just as there are composite literary texts throughout pre-modern literature. And in the modern era, there are plenty of works that claim to be more explicitly, or are more explicit about claiming to be heterotextual than The Lord of the Rings. For example, Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire, B.S. Johnson's The Unfortunates, Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, John Gardner's October Light, the young adult novel I Am the Cheese by Robert Cormier. All of those are very explicit. They say, they give the impression, they say I'm made up of multiple texts being put together. But Tolkien's heterotextuality is qualitatively different than that found in those works. The reader is not required to sift through obviously incomplete, biased, or contradictory materials and extract a narrative. The reader doesn't have to deal with non-chronological fragments. And furthermore, Tolkien does not continually assert that various sections of his work were written by other authors, a situation quite different from Pale Fire or John Gardner's October Light. But in contrast to that rather heavy-handed and somewhat unsuccessfully, or at least in stylistic terms, heterotextuality of Nabokov and Gardner, not to mention the myriad of incomplete and contradictory pseudo-documents in Danielewski or Cormier, Tolkien's heterotextuality is subtle. It operates at multiple levels of abstraction. There is the explicit frame narrative, and when I say explicit, I do know that the whole complex translation of the Red Book of Westmarch by Professor J.R.R. Tolkien frame with its explicitly named authors, editors, and contributors, Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Findegil, the King's Writer, and other anonymous scribes, is not really explicit except in the preface and Appendix F, which many, many, many readers skip. So, but nevertheless, it is explicit. There are the invocations of other texts that I've mentioned, but the effective and aesthetically and emotionally powerful heterotextuality of Tolkien's work is to be found less at the level of a frame narrative and more at the level of lower levels of abstraction, in the gaps and inconsistencies, in the apparent contradictions in the narrative, in shifts in point of view or focalization, in subtle variations of prose style, including variations in vocabulary distribution, and even the frequency of function words that are too diffuse to be detected by the unaided human brain. Additionally, at least a portion of Tolkien's heterotextuality has a different ontogeny than that of the other writers. I've mentioned in that it seems not have been intentional. and that may make it more convincing. And these 2 points may be related, as I hope you'll see. Now, given the constraints, I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail as I would like on each of these levels. Instead, I will wave my copy of The Tower in the Ruin around very authoritatively and tell you that the evidence is there. The book. But I hope you'll trust me on this, and hopefully you can read it for yourself. And hopefully by then you'll also have forgotten any claims that I make that happen to turn out to be unfounded. So we'll be in great shape. I'll just note that the conceit of the Red Book, that is the big red book with leather covers given by Frodo to Sam, having been modified and augmented both by various Hobbit scribes in the Shire's libraries in the century after the events of the Lord of the Rings, and then by Findigil, the king's writer, and potentially by other scholars in Gondor, has the effect of naturalizing phenomena that might otherwise be jarring or difficult for a reader to accept. For example, Sam, in extremis, suddenly calling out words in a language he does not know, which I am completely happy to believe, and then remembering what he said months later and writing it down in flawless Elvish, which I don't believe for a second. A useful comparison might be the insertion of the Old English versions of Cadman's hymn into the manuscripts of the Latin text of Bede's ecclesiastical history by someone other than Bede. Similarly, we can imagine that a scribe in Gondor fluent in Elvish figured out what words would have been appropriate for Sam to say in that moment, and must have been what he said when he's faced with the terror of Shelob. Now, Sam's exclamation is in italic type, which is how Tolkien prints the many poems in the narrative, as well as prose textual materials such as Gandalf's letter to Frodo, the wizard's reading of the material from Isildur's scroll, the ring inscription, the text on the west gate of Moria, and the excerpts from the Book of Mazarbul. The italicized poems and other materials contribute to the impression, albeit a subtle one that not all readers recognize, that the physical text that the reader produces is made up of other texts, all of which, by implication, may have different authors and different transmission histories. Note that this impression does not rely on the reader being aware of the existence of that frame narrative of the Red Book or any frame narrative. And perhaps the most helpful example is Bilbo's birthday speech, because it took me years to notice this, and I have scoured Tolkien scholarship to see if anyone else noticed it. But Bilbo's birthday speech, every word the old Hobbit says aloud is in italics. But the interleaved descriptions, actions, narrative commentary, speech by other characters, proud feet, for example, is all in Roman type. And when viewed in light of all the other italicized elements in The Lord of the Rings, the implication must be that Bilbo brought a written copy of his birthday speech with him to Rivendell. It does say he put it back in his pocket. He was very proud of that speech, and incorporated it into the narrative of his birthday party that he wrote as part of his contribution to The Lord of the Rings. After all, just taking the point of view, he's the only one who can write most of chapter 1. Because he knows what he was doing, thinking, interacting with Gandalf, and so forth. Now, we read this birthday letter at the very beginning of the story, and that's before any conventions of italics would have taken hold in the reader, and that might be why no one notices it. But these italics were actually present from a very early stage of composition. They were there so early that when Tolkien first underlined the material and marked it as italic, the entire narrative had only reached the point of the post-party labeled gifts, and Bilbo's climactic announcement was that he was going away to get married. We can therefore conclude with some confidence that Tolkien had the production of some kind of this kind of heterotextuality, the subtle indication of included text of the narrative, in mind for almost the entire composition process of The Lord of the Rings, even though the explicit frame narrative of the Red Book of Westmarch is invented a great deal later in that process. Thus far, I focused on explicit, or at least obvious, indications of extra-textual material in The Lord of the Rings. The frame narrative, the mention of text beyond the text, and the inclusion of italicized material intended to be seen as coming from other texts. But Tolkien's great work is also filled with implicit indications of heterotextuality. And these include the gaps and contradictions or the inconsistencies, the shifts in focalization, the presence of broken or pseudo references, and a level that may not be consciously available to the reader, the uneven distribution of vocabulary. The largest of the inconsistencies is the treatment of Bilbo's retelling of the riddle game in chapter 5 of The Hobbit. In the original 1937 text, as we know, Bilbo wins the contest via the questionable "what have I got in my pocket" question, and then Gollum goes back to his island to get a present he had promised to Bilbo if the Hobbit won, a magic ring, the one Bilbo actually has in his pocket. When he realizes that Gollum realizes he has lost this present, he returns, cringing and apologetic, and eventually agrees to show the Hobbit out of the way out of the tunnels in place of the missing gift. They part amicably. For obvious reasons, this original version of the story was a significant problem in the development of the Lord of the Rings plot. Eventually, Tolkien hit on the idea of revising The Hobbit. He could not come up with any other way to make it work with the way he was thinking of the ring, so he came up with the idea of revising The Hobbit to eliminate Gollum's willingness to give away the ring, and even rewrote the key passages in such a way that they used the same amount of space per line so that they could replace the part without requiring typesetting the entire book and just typeset the relevant pages. But then, to his surprise, in 1951, Allen and Unwin typeset the entire book and incorporated his new changes in it without telling him. He was surprised and pleased to see that, and it's been there for the text of all subsequent printing. But that solves one problem by creating another. Because how would readers who knew only the 1937 to 1950 Hobbit, and it's important to remember that in 1951, that was all the readers of The Hobbit, understand the treatment of the incident in The Lord of the Rings, where, the one we're familiar with. Tolkien solved that problem by asserting that in The Lord of the Rings, that Bilbo had told the dwarves, Gandalf, and everyone else a false story, intended to put his claim to the ring beyond question, although he did reveal the truth to Frodo. This solved the problem of the conflict between the pre-1951 versions and The Lord of the Rings, but it spawned a new problem, and one that I remember being very confused about when my father read me The Lord of the Rings. If a reader had only read the post-1951 Hobbit, Bilbo's admitting to having told a different version of the story makes no sense, because every version of the story we've heard is the correct one. And the version in The Hobbit was completely consistent with what is said in The Lord of the Rings, so the story makes no sense. What was Bilbo talking about? And the result of Tolkien's revisions is that there is some inconsistency around the story of Bilbo's acquisition of the ring, no matter which edition of The Hobbit a reader reads. Either the story will conflict with the story in The Hobbit, or it will not conflict, and therefore you won't understand what on earth Bilbo is talking about there. You cannot find a better example of mid-level heterotextuality than this, particularly once it became unlikely that there was a reader around who would read the pre-1951 Hobbit. Not only is there a text behind the story of The Lord of the Rings being referred to, there are two versions of that text that contradict each other. Several slightly smaller apparent contradictions or inconsistencies in the narrative are already well known and studied, whether Treebeard or Tom Bombadil is the oldest being in Middle-earth. Tom Bombadil. Glorfindel's horse, having originally had a bridle and bit, despite elves riding bareback, then Tolkien revising the bridle and bit out, but retaining the reins and the saddle, because Frodo is able to check the horse with the reins, what are the reins attached to do this in the later versions. Again, how many ponies were in the stable behind the Crick Hollow house? Is it 6 for the original 6 hobbits that were supposed to be there? Is it 5? Hammond and Skull revised that whole pony out. I'm not sure they should, but I understand where they're coming from. And then finally, Sauron does not allow his servants to use his name except for the messenger of Mordor and the mouth of Sauron, who introduces himself as "I am the mouth of Sauron." So those are fine, but more interesting are the less obvious gaps and contradictions that appear to be caused by Tolkien's inconsistent revision process, when the larger context of a scene or a phrase was radically modified, but the original image or scene remained despite the new context. Sometimes this simply produced a dramatic scene, as when Tolkien transformed an original scene of a cloaked rider stopping sniffing for the hobbits, and then revealing himself as Gandalf into the famous snuffling Black Rider scene. And you can actually infer that the joke was the same thing that Tolkien was going on about in The Hobbit, that Smaug would recognize Hobbit smell, but Gandalf could recognize Hobbit smells when they're hiding in the bushes. But then this turns into a sniffing Black Rider. Another example, the result is more ambiguous. Tolkien originally had the ranger, whom the hobbits meet in Bree, be a hobbit himself, Trotter, who had suffered some sort of torture by Sauron. The Black Riders, he tells Sam, Frodo, and Pippin, will come on you in the wild, in some dark place where there is no help. Do you wish them to find you? They are terrible. The hobbits looked at him and saw with surprise that his face was drawn as if with pain, and his hands clenched the arm of his chair. The room was very quiet and still, and the light seemed to have grown dim. For a while he sat with unseeing eyes, as if walking in distant memory, or listening to sounds in the night far away. But Trotter, the wild hobbit, was eventually transformed into Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, who, if Appendix B can be relied upon, never encountered the Nazgul before the attack on Weathertop. That Aragorn nevertheless gives every impression of having distant memories triggered by the thought of the Black Riders, despite there being no narrative warrant for this, and the unexplained capitalization of the word night in the passage, which I cannot figure out, both strongly suggest that this small portion of the narrative derives from some other tradition or set of knowledge that the person who wrote it had access to different information than is presented in the text of The Lord of the Rings with which the reader is engaged. In the interest of time, I'm only going to touch on the implications of Tolkien's use of broken and pseudo references, especially because not every example of these implies the incorporation of extra textual material. But we can't skip them entirely, as their presence has important implications for understanding of just how intentional Tolkien's heterotextuality is. A broken reference are things that invoke cultural knowledge that once existed but no longer does. When Chaucer makes references to Wade and his boat, or when the name Ermenloff shows up in Beowulf, and we have no idea because Ermenloff's name shows up nowhere else in all of Northern literature. Those are broken references. In The Lord of the Rings, Elrond's comparison of Frodo to the great elf friends of old, Hador and Húrin and Túrin and Beren himself, is only a broken reference because when Tolkien published the Council of Elrond, the relevant cultural information did not exist, but it did exist in the unpublished Silmarillion material. In contrast, the cats of Queen Beruthiel had absolutely no existence anywhere when Tolkien made them up for the reference in A Journey in the Dark. And they are a pseudo-reference rather than a broken reference. Now, the thing is, as far as readers are concerned, broken references and pseudo-references are the same thing. They produce the same effect. And they create the sense that the text that they are reading comes from a different culture and tradition in which these things were common knowledge. And to try to explain this to my students, sometimes I say, imagine that someone finds a Tom Clancy novel 3,000 years in the future, when everything is changed. And from that, they draw the conclusion that Americans in the 20th century somehow worshipped a geometric object, because there will be all these statements that the Pentagon says we must do this. The Pentagon said we had to go there. Because, of course, in that text, Tom Clancy is never going to stop and explain what the Pentagon is, because everybody knows that. But they might not in 3,000 years, and you'll get a strange reconstruction of religion in America in the 20th century. One of the things that broken and broken references do then is they indicate that the text that the reader is reading is somehow either foreign or old or both. The effect is not itself heterotextuality, though it does substantially contribute to the impression of depth that Tolkien realized was an important quality of The Lord of the Rings. But broken and pseudo-references can produce heterotextuality when they give the impression of being, or at least being in the process of becoming, traditional reference. And I apologize that reference and referent are as confusingly similar as Sauron and Saruman's names were to the scriptwriters for The Lord of the Rings. You can blame oral traditional studies for choosing these terms, but a reference is what I've been talking about. A traditional referent, I'll explain, is a reference that has been repeated enough times for its surface level form to be to some degree fixed. I'm going to leave out a detailed way of how this happens, but essentially, that the fixed or stable surface level form almost always has poetic characteristics, whatever these are for a given tradition or language, because poetic forms are exactly those that exhibit greater mnemonic stability. So a traditional referent is when you say something like Korythealos Hector or Glaukopis Athena all the time. And that's the same term used multiple times in the text. It's the repetition of a fixed or semi-fixed, because formulaic form, and it invokes traditional knowledge through metonymy and what John Miles Foley used to call communicative economy. You can tell a lot of material just by saying Korythealos Hector. To participants in a living tradition, formulaic phrases like this invoke the complete personae of the characters and a lot of other information. But when the tradition is no longer living, but has been reduced to written works, and sometimes only one or two written works, then such only the denotative meanings of Hector and Athena have been retained. Instead, the presence of traditional reference implies that the work that we are reading was once part of a much larger old tradition that is distinct from the work we're reading. In other words, even just those little lines show the influence of other texts, whether those were oral poems or written poems isn't really relevant for the feeling and the impression it creates. There are a few evolving or perhaps even established traditional reference in Tolkien's works. Probably we should call these pseudo-reference, but we've had enough pseudo, so we're just going to call them traditional reference. We identify these through their poetic features in, for example, name-epithet combinations. Note the repetition of initial H and R sounds in Hador the Golden-Haired, who is probably as close to a real traditional referent as I can find, because he's mentioned that Hador the Golden-Haired multiple times in the Silmarillion material, as well as in the Lord of the Rings, or of the vowels in Elrond the Half-Elven, or the K in the Cats of Queen Beruthiel, or Goldberry's epithets, daughter of the river, river daughter, river woman's daughter, which not only includes the repetition of the R sounds, but is metrical and has near rhyme on river and daughter. Probably the best example is Eowyn, dearer than daughter, which Theoden says as his death is approaching. It is a slightly poetic or ornamented phrase, and note that Eomer repeats it in its exact form when he says, Theoden said, Eowyn, dearer than daughter. This is how a traditional referent would be created, and the evidence that it's becoming one is that it's repeated in its exact form. The point being, that's the traditional thing you said there, and now it's been incorporated into the text. The present of these apparent proto-traditional reference implies the influence of a series of transmissions, and it therefore helps produce the impression that the work is old, the same way a smoothly polished pebble in a stream indicates a long history of weathering, whereas sharp rocks do not. I'm going to compress just a bit and note that certain shifts in point of view and focalization also contribute to the heterotextuality of the narrative. Verlin Flieger has argued that the notion that the Lord of the Rings was written by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam is just a helpful organizing conceit and, quote, not a substantial structural factor, since if a variety of narrative characteristics are brought together, quote, the whole concept falls apart. Now, I really, really hesitate to say this because I co-edited Tolkien studies with the woman for over 20 years. I'm pretty sure I never won an argument with her. But I actually disagree with Verlin here. I think that when we add the concept of heterotextuality, most of those objections vanish. There are some passages that are almost certainly could not be written by the three ostensible narrators, but they turn out to be the passages that most sound like they came from another text or another writer. For example, the opening of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. But it was no orc chieftain or brigand that led the assault upon Gondor. The darkness was breaking too soon, before the date his master had set for it. Fortune had betrayed him for the moment, and the world had turned against him. Victory was slipping from his grasp even as he stretched out his hand to seize it. But his arm was long. He was still in command, wielding great powers. King, Ringwraith, Lord of the Nazgul. He had many weapons. He left the gate and vanished. Now, I don't think that we are meant to believe that that was written by the Lord of the Nazgul. but I don't think we can also really believe that it was written even by Frodo or Bilbo or Sam. That has the feel of something authoritative that came from maybe a history of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Similarly, at the approach to Isengard, we read, "But Saruman had made it better, as he thought, being deceived, for all those arts and subtle devices, for which he forsook his former wisdom, and which fondly he imagined were his own, but it came from Mordor, so that he made was naught, only a little copy, a child's model, or a slave's flattery of that vast fortress," etc., etc. By the way, from just those two quotes, the one person that could have written them is Gandalf. But what I really get from those is how much Tolkien came to loathe and despise Saruman. That little line, "It was no orc chieftain or brigand," that's not just random. That's saying, unlike the Battle of Helm's Deep, which was led by an orc chieftain or a brigand, and here that it was just a child's model or a slave's flattery. Tolkien really came to dislike Saruman, quite earned. For example, there's also the description of the defiled land in front of Mordor, or of the layout, architecture, and history of Brandy Hall, and various other passages of geographical and historical description. These can only be, with really special pleading and doing violence to our understanding of their personalities, inferred to be written by Bilbo, Frodo, or Sam. In contradistinction to the damn talking fox, which some of you know has driven me crazy for decades, but it's obvious that must be Bilbo's playful contribution, just like the talking purse in the Trolls. So that is never explained how you can have a talking purse, and it's just dropped. By themselves, by the way, these viewpoint shifts do not create the impression of textuality, but when they are combined with the extremely consistent, least knowledgeable character focalization that Tolkien uses everywhere else, they imply that the compilation of The Lord of the Rings included material in texts other than those written by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam as their diaries of their experiences. Finally, we come to variations in prose style, which I have to this point avoided discussing, despite perhaps there being the most obvious contributors to any sense of heterotextuality. As I noted previously, the mere statement that several paragraphs of this talk were written by my pet unicorn Clarence is not enough to produce heterotextuality, but the combination of that assertion with a few paragraphs in some sufficiently distinctive style, perhaps in those I sound erudite, calm, or reasonable, might generate the impression that there was more than one text and more than one author involved. Now, if you're thinking that such variations in prose style are among the most highly praised qualities of literary works, not just Tolkien's works, you are not wrong. Tolkien's pilgrims each have such unique voices that each time I teach the Canterbury Tales, I have to remind not just the students, but myself, that Chaucer wrote all the words, and we are not actually hearing what the wife of Bath thinks or what the pardoner said. Likewise, Faulkner is justly praised for the chapter-by-chapter variation in style in As I Lay Dying, or Alice Walker in differentiating the letters of Seeley from those of Nettie by their style, and of course, most of all, Joyce for the differences between the styles of Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus, and Molly Bloom. But those are all examples of multivocality, heteroglossia, not heterotextuality. In none of those cases do readers get the impression that the sections of the text associated with the different characters has a different transmission history, or that they are much older or younger than their surrounding matrix. The illusion is that different characters are speaking, writing, or thinking, and that is powerful and persuasive, but it is not textualized. Furthermore, a few decades of computational stylometry has demonstrated that single author texts actually exhibit quite a bit less internal variation in the measurable features of their vocabularies or their languages than anyone might expect. The Benji chapters of The Sound and the Fury and all the sufficiently long chapters of As I Lay Dying to apply these tests to are still easily identified by pretty much every stylometry measure as being more Faulknerian than they are Hemingway-esque, for example. And similarly, correct classifications can be done using a whole variety of stylometric techniques. The intra-text and intra-author consistency of characteristics like sentence length, word choice, degree of subordination, and frequency of function words, the things that enable stylometry and author identification, which works surprisingly well despite how many critics hate it completely, with a disproportionate passion. I don't know why, but they do. But all of those things show that within an individual author's work, there's actually a great deal more similarity than we might expect. What we tend to see then in styometric analysis is not only do authors' prose styles tend to be generally similar across a given work, but that within a work, prose style seems to vary somewhat smoothly from section to section or chapter to chapter in order of composition. That is, on average, chapter 3 tends to be more like chapter 4 than it is like chapter 11. And chapter 11 tends to be more like chapter 12 than it is like chapter 2. When on occasion we find something like chapter 1 seeming more like chapter 6 and 7, as we do in The Sun Also Rises, we then discover that that chapter used to be chapter 5, and Hemingway moved it. However, this is not what we see in The Lord of the Rings. And can you put the diagram up for me? I'll hold this at arm's length. That compares the distribution of vocabulary by chapter. So essentially what we did is we took every word in every chapter and made a ranked list of their frequencies. So for the entire text and for every chapter. And then we simply compared them using a metric called Euclidean distance. So the chapters are grouped by similarity. In other words, how close in vocabulary are they? One thing you can see is that in the middle there's an arrow pointing at Journey in the Dark, The Ring Goes South, chapters 15 and 16, I'm just inclusive numbering. They are the most similar. Well, that's because they were all written at once and was one long chapter, and then Tolkien just drew a line between them. We can also see, though, some very interesting and non-similar pieces. And you'll notice that chapter 10, Strider, out here, is the most different. You can tell similarity is based on where the branch point is. So the further the branch point, the more different the two pieces are. This is done using the Lexos software suite, and it's called hierarchical agglomerative clustering. What we tend to see in most single-author texts, even ones of significant length, is that you'll see chapters clustering together, and you won't see a very large hierarchical structure there. In other words, you'll see a grouping that's chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but added in a stepwise fashion, as you see right here, right? So you get a pairing, Blackgate opens, and the Battle of the Palmar Fields, and that is the Field of Cormorant, then the Sword of the King, and then the Grey Havens. Now, the difference is, in Tolkien, those chapters are all they're all in the Return of the King, but they're kind of all over the place in the Return of the King. They don't go in sequence. In most of the other single author texts we've looked at, you would see them going in sequence. So what you get then is a complex hierarchical dendrogram with several large groupings and a few outliers. The most dramatic of these is chapter 10, Strider, which is kind of bizarre because it used to be part of chapter 9 at the Sign of the Prancing Pony, and Tolkien split it in half, and yet Strider becomes so different there. You also see subclusters, and the thing is that none of these are grouped, based on anything that's obvious to see how they work. So in other words, chapters from all 6 of the books are spread across all the different large clusters. The Frodo and Sam point of view chapters are mixed in with the Merry and Pippin point of view chapters from the Two Towers and the Return of the King. Now, the geometry of this dendrogram, however, is somewhat correlated with the revision history of The Lord of the Rings. I'm going to refer you, because the details are hard to communicate orally anyway, to volume 21 of Tolkien Studies, which is currently at the printer and not just at the press now. So it actually should be showing up in something less than geological time. In an article by Pei-Jen Wu and I that goes into the great, some of our outside readers even said excruciating detail about how Strider ended up becoming the second most revised chapter in The Lord of the Rings. An Unexpected Party is the most revised one, but it's really, some of those revisions were not very substantial, where Strider, he had to keep tearing it up and putting it back together again. By the way, Pei-Jen is about to defend her PhD in digital humanities at University of Illinois, and it'd be great if someone hired her. But I will just say that Tolkien's complex and uneven revision process led to a distribution of vocabulary, even of the most basic function words like and, the, of, and in, that is far more characteristic of a multi-authored or traditional text than it is of a single-authored 20th century work. And what you probably can't see, sorry, I want to show the, so can I go to the next slide? As just tiny bits of evidence, here is a rolling window diagram of the relative frequency of and from chapter to chapter in the Lord of the Rings. And you'll notice, it's very hard to see, but you'll notice that you have some incredibly high levels of and. So that in the English language as a whole, and is somewhere usually around 0.03, so percent of the words used. In the House of Tom Bombadil, it reaches almost 7%. It's almost twice as much. On the other hand, at the end of the Council of Elrond, it dips to almost nothing, and in the Strider chapter. And so you can see that there's a lot of variation there, and that it's not by book, by point of view, or seemingly anything else. And it is, in fact, by revision history, sort of. Tom Bombadil is one of the least revised chapters, but it wasn't really revised any more than the Old Forest or Fog on the Barrow Downs, and that's something I'm still working, trying to figure out why. If we go to the next slide, this is the average of the in the Lord of the Rings, and here it does seem as if extensive revision reduces the frequency of the. You'll see in Conspiracy Unmasked, which is one of the more revised chapters, in Strider, and in the Taming of Smeagol, which was revised again and again also, as Tolkien couldn't figure out how to get them out of the Emmy Mule. Now, I concede without contesting at the point that it is unlikely that readers can detect such small and widely distributed variations consciously. But it's not impossible that even if they themselves do not contribute to the direct impression of heterotextuality, the kinds of variations for which these things serve as proxies, in other words, average sentence length, degree of coordination versus subordination, that's where your ands go. The more Tolkien revised, the more he's shifted from just setting things next to each other to giving them hypotactic organization. Modifier frequency, active versus passive voice. So modifier frequency goes with the. You get rid of thes because you replaced it with adjectives instead. I already said that. These are what readers actually perceive when they detect variations in prose style, particularly those variations that are characteristic of heterotextual works. The larger point is that Tolkien's works exhibit the characteristics of heterotextuality from the level of the frame narrative to the distribution of function words and many levels in between. And so without being consciously aware of it, readers, I think, recognize consistent patterns of variation at multiple levels of abstraction, of being characteristic of works that are old and much handled, the kind of works that we sometimes have to read in a scholarly edition or with an apparatus to help us explain them. Some of the heterotextuality of The Lord of the Rings seems to have been quite intentional. Bilbo's birthday speech, the cats of Queen Beruthiel, and some of the allusions that I have not had time to discuss, distinct from a reference, the most prominent two being the Watcher in the Water's destruction of the two holly trees in front of the west gate of Moria, echoing Ungoliant's poisoning of the two trees of Valinor, which happened to be depicted on that west gate, and Sam's brief consideration of methods of suicide when he believes Frodo is dead, which turn out to be exactly the two that were used by Turin and Nienor. But those are allusions, not direct references. But it's entirely possible that a large fraction of the heterotextuality of The Lord of the Rings is the unintended result of Tolkien's complex and uneven process of composition and revision, augmented by the many broken references caused by the publisher's refusal to publish the Silmarillion in advance of The Lord of the Rings. And in fairness to Sir Stanley Unwin, I should rephrase that maybe to be Tolkien's inability to put the Silmarillion into a publishable form. Can't really blame Sir Stanley for not publishing what Tolkien gave him at that time. But if this is the case, then it is among the happiest accidents in literary history, because heterotextuality communicates substantially to the impression that Tolkien's works give of being the product of a long and complex composition and transmission history, and thus somehow being older and more authentic than the printed volumes that the readers are holding in their hands. Very few other works of fantasy, or for that matter, of fiction, produce such a strong impression as being part of a textual tradition as Tolkien's. And that is a big part of what makes them feel so true despite their subject matter.